Hey there humans, Bob here, welcome to another Marvel Avengers video. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you my first build video of my Iron Man Prime build. Before we get going with this one though, don't forget to drop a like, it massively helps to get more eyes on the video, and it's completely free. Great, now that's over with, let's get on with the video. So before we get into it, let's go over the sections that we're going to cover in this video. Number 1, stats, just how I've built my hero and why I focused on these stats. Number 2, what skills I've selected and why. 3, champion points, what my focus around endgame leveling is. Number 4, gear, which perks I'm focusing on and why, and also where to farm this gear. And 5, showcase, how this build works in actual combat. Right, let's start with the stats that I focus on. With an Iron Man range build, or a build that uses his weapons in general, that's repulsors, lasers or missiles, you'll want to focus on precision as your main stat, as this will increase your damage output from those weapons. I also make sure to focus at least a little on proficiency, because that ensures I hit as many critical attacks as possible for the increased damage, but also as a lot of my perks work off of crits too, so it's important to have that in there. To build off of this, I've focused quite heavily on Valor too, as this not only increases the damage output of heroics, but also boosts crit damage. I have mine around about 300% right now, which really helps to take enemies out very quickly. Finally, I've made sure to have at least some resolve and resilience in this build. Until recently, it's been thought that it's better to have more resolve instead of resilience, as resolve isn't subject to diminishing returns, but as raid gear tends to roll very high on resilience, we're seeing a bit of a 180 on this, as in some cases, players have been able to make 100% armor builds that literally negate all damage. Let's move on to skills now. Obviously I have all of Iron Man's base skills unlocked, but let's go into the specifics, starting with the specialty tree. Under support heroic ability, I have Arc Supercharge. This increases the duration of overcharge by 3 seconds. This helps to keep the damage buff up for longer and my intrinsic in its unlimited state too, which means I can use my weaponry for longer. Next, under support, I use Arc Jolt. If you're a solo player, you might want to use the one-way bubble instead, but as a lot of the conduit perks on raid gear work off of revives, I've opted for this. It definitely helps if multiple allies go down in difficult activities like the raid and OLT2. Now onto assault specializations. The first is Precision Refractor, which extends the unibeam by 3 seconds. This helps me maintain damage output for longer on bosses, as well as keeps me in the iframe animation longer, which makes me invincible for the duration that I have the button held down. Just in case you didn't know by the way, if you want your unibeam to last longer, just hold the button down longer. I only mention it as so many people always ask me how to do it on stream. Also, another reason I have the unibeam extended is because of the second specialization I use, which is Energy Condenser, which ensures that any enemy that is defeated by the unibeam drops a heroic orb. That way you can literally replenish your unibeam almost instantly. This feeds into some of the gear perks I use, but we'll get into that later. Now we move on to the ultimate specializations, the first being Disruption Pulse. This pulse outputs a staggering amount of stun damage when in the Hulkbuster, which is incredibly useful when fighting Claw, as a large part of fighting him consists of dealing stun damage. Not only that, but you can even deploy the Hulkbuster for a teammate to jump into if they don't deal too much stun damage themselves. Pro tip here, you can even coordinate to keep a teammate in Hulkbuster for longer if you use your overcharge near them before the meter runs out. Speaking of keeping the Hulkbuster out for longer, I also use the Hypercoil specialization to keep the armor out for longer. Really helpful if you need to use it to protect yourself or stay safe when reviving allies. Although occasionally when fighting Claw, I have switched up to the 25% reduction in energy usage to keep outputting that stun damage for longer. I'll let you decide which one you end up going for. Now onto the Mastery skill tree. This is where we can start to fine tune a lot of stuff to really get the best out of this build. Firstly, I use Combo Finisher Mastery. I don't tend to use combo finishers all that much, but it's the best of the 3 available for my playstyle. Secondly, I have Heroic Takedown Mastery. I used to use the regen pack one, but the ability to generate heroic orbs adds more utility and can also help teammates that rely on heroics too. And the third on the Combat Mastery tree is Ranged Combat Mastery, that gives a flat 15% damage boost to all range attacks, which is the bread and butter of this build. Now onto the Ranged Mastery tree. On the first branch, I use Rocket Mastery, simply because rockets can output the most damage and also cause splash damage, which means you can hit groups of enemies at once or even weak points on bosses like the Warbot, which saves you a considerable amount of time. On the second branch, I continue with the rocket improvements and use rocket specialization to add a targeting system to rockets, which allows me to reduce the amount of attacks I miss. This is super helpful in hectic fights. On the third and final branch, again, more rocket improvements, this time using rocket efficiency to decrease the amount of intrinsic energy used when firing rockets by 10%, so I can use them longer without having to switch up to melee or heroic attacks. Let's look at the intrinsic mastery tree now. In the first branch, I use Arc Reactor Generator. Generally, this isn't needed as I'll usually use Overcharge to fully replenish my intrinsic, but in the rare occasions that I don't have heroics, this really helps to keep me in the fight. In the second branch, I use Overcharge Duration, which only adds 2 seconds to my overcharge state, but despite being a short addition, it really makes a big difference, as that's 2 more seconds of unlimited weapon usage and continues to feed into the build in another way, which I'll talk about shortly. Lastly, in the third branch, I use Overcharge Damage Boost, which gives a nice 12.5% damage boost whilst overcharged, which is pretty helpful considering you can proc it easily by using your support heroic or by using your energy shield. Which leads us to the final mastery tree, the utility tree. Firstly, to optimize the use of the shield, I use energy shield efficiency, which reduces the intrinsic cost of activating it, which means you're burning less intrinsic as you want to regenerate it, not deplete it. Which is exactly why I use empowering barrier to regen 5% of my intrinsic every second when near the barrier. The cool thing about this is that it doesn't just regen your intrinsic, but any teammate near it. And they stack too. So if you have a team of 4 Iron Men, then you can get up to 20% regen per second. And the final skill selection is a pretty easy one. I use Air Superiority to increase rain damage by 15% whilst flying. Right, now we've gone over skill choices, let's talk about champion skill focuses. I tend to focus on similar skills with all heroes with a little variance, but when the champion system launched, we didn't really know what was the best thing to focus on. Naturally, I wanted to get more range damage with my Iron Man, but it turns out that the whole combat boost section basically adds pretty much nothing to your character. So with that in mind, here's my priority order for champion points. Quick note though, I wouldn't suggest going all the way to the 5th unlocks until you have spread points across the other skills, as 16 champion points aren't that easy to come across outside of XP boost events. By the way, if you want to see the quickest way to level your champion points, don't forget to check out my fast XP leveling video, the link's in the description down below if you need it. Right, onto the list. Number 1, critical damage. This is going to give you a 5% boost to crit damage, which this build focuses on, so a major priority on this. Number 2, heroic recharge. With a 2.5% boost to recharge per unlock, this will help you to regain your heroics incredibly quickly in general, but with this build, it'll help you to have almost infinite heroics. Number 3, perk chance. Basically, the more you unlock this tree, the more chance you'll have of proccing stuff like damage buff, payloads, and more, which help with pretty much every build. Number 4, critical chance. Although this only gives you a 1% extra crit chance boost, it really helps to close the gap towards 100% crit chance, which this build focuses heavily on. Number 5, stun and status damage. You'll gain an additional 2% on both of these damage types, which will help when dealing battery damage, but also stun, which really helps during certain raid phases. And finally, number 6, fortification boost. As I focus on resilience a lot with this build to lower any incoming damage, this is my main defensive focus, as all unlocks will provide a flat 5% additional armor. After these, feel free to put points wherever you like, but also make sure to leave the combat ones until last, as they have the least utility across the board. Right, now, let's take a look at gear. In slot 1, I settled on this piece for now. Mainly as it's rolled decently high stats for legendary, it has Valor, Precision, and Resilience, which are key focuses for this build. I'm not a fan of light combo finishers or heroic charge burst on this piece. I'd prefer Faultless Buff or Faultless Empowerment to add more options to proc overcharge, which I do have on an alternate piece, but the stat roll and the shock on signature attacks, which is my favorite stats to have, as any enemy that has a stack of shock is more susceptible to critical hits, definitely swings it for me. The final perk though, Armory Boon, is key to my build as it adds a flat 13.8% critical chance from all weapon attacks, which brings my ranged crit chance up to around 40%. Unfortunately, this piece is not a targeted farmable piece, so you will have to just keep opening chests and hope that you are blessed by RNGesus. I suggest you run either Day of the Remains, Out of the Shadows, one of the vaults, or maybe even Here Comes the Pain, especially if you're hoping for the Faultless perk on the first perk slot. In slot 2 is the only discordant sound raid piece I'm running in this build. The stat roll is nice and high, but realistically it's missing a third stat. I'd love for that to be precision, so I'll keep running the raid with the hope of rolling it with the third stat. But ultimately, the perks are pretty much perfect. First of all, Shock Double Leak allows me to hit any enemy affected by the sonic status with shock, which I have on both my signature attacks, but also my support heroic, which means I can spread the shock status to all nearby enemies too, making them more susceptible to critical hits. On the second perk, I have all ranged attacks whilst aiming or flying deal sonic status damage. This is great as it sets me up for the first perk, but also sonic status returns heroic and intrinsic energy when near an enemy with the effect, which is great for Iron Man in general. Finally though, the third perk is what sells this piece and why I'm happy to sacrifice a third stat for now. Basically, every time I hit with a critical ranged attack, there is a 1 in 3 chance of hitting my target, or when using missiles that can mean multiple targets at once thanks to splash damage, with a vibranium payload, which instantly inflicts a full stack of vibranium status on the target. Hit them again with another sonic ranged attack and you'll get battery damage just using this one piece. If you want to farm this piece, just run the regular version of the Discordant Sound Raid. Now onto slot 3, which is where we start to close some gaps in the build. Unfortunately, I only have this piece with this stat roll as an epic, but I'd love to roll this as a legendary for that extra stat boost. But here I've got Valor, Precision again, but this time with a little proficiency to help with crit and perk chance. The only perk I'm really focused on this piece is actually the reactive buff. This perk not only allows me to gain a damage boost when I'm hit, which as a flyer is honestly quite often, but it also boosts my crit chance by a whopping 60%, which closes the gap from the 40% crit chance mentioned earlier to give me 100% crit chance whilst the damage buff is active, which basically means double damage to every single hit, not including the damage boost from the perk itself or the battery effect from slot 2. Once you can stack all of these together, you'll be outputting a huge amount of damage with every single ranged hit. The second perk is fine. I'd love for a different role there, preferably something like Intrinsic or Heroic Burst on defeating enemies or something similar, but it's fine for now. The third perk is basically just a bonus though, as it means whilst I'm in the air, which is pretty much always as Iron Man, I take 10% less damage, which is really helpful. That said, it's not key to the build, so don't panic if you don't get that role, which is good news as this piece isn't a targeted farmable piece. Again, just open chests until you get the roles you like. Finally, we have slot 4, and likely the piece I would suggest for almost any Iron Man build is the Centurion's Mark 15 Quantum Reactor. This piece has rolled Resolve, Valor and Precision, which is perfect for a ranged crit build like mine, but has one perk that transforms decent builds into something incredible. The first perk, Breaker Buster, is fine. 20% extra damage whilst wearing the Hulk Buster is great. The second perk even increases the rate which Hulk Buster Ultimate recharges, so you'll be in it sooner. But what you're really looking for on this piece is Overcharge Support. This perk says it increases heroic charge rate by 2.2% whilst overcharged, but it's actually more like 200%. For context, this has been reported to the devs and is technically appears to be broken, but from what we've heard back, it's actually working as intended. Basically, what this perk allows you to do is use your support heroic to instantly overcharge yourself, then use the Unibeam to defeat a minimum of 2 enemies, which if you have the skill set, as I showed in this video, you'll get at least 2 heroic orbs. Pick these up and you will have all of your heroics back, despite only just using them seconds before. Literally doesn't take any more than that, which means you can constantly recharge your own heroics within seconds and your intrinsic too, meaning you are your own self-sustaining heroic and intrinsic battery. And the good news is, this piece is actually a targeted farmable piece. It drops from the last Avengers standing mission. It's a bit of a slog and it's single player only, but it's 100% worth it. For the minor artifacts, I use 1 ISO 8 of Cosmic Affinity. I use this mainly for the reactive Cosmic Surge, which means every time I take damage, I can self-heal and regenerate heroic energy. I tend to make sure that I get either Precision, Valor, or Proficiency on these, and the Heroic Assault perk really helps to get the Unibeam Heroic back quicker, which is great, despite not being all that important. You can farm this from the OLT or DNA chests found in vaults. I also use a 3-stat blue ISO to boost my range damage with the high rolling precision, but I basically use this slot to balance stats out where they are lacking in my build. These drop from pretty much any chest, drop zone, or you can even buy them from vendors. Finally, this is more down to preference, but for the major artifact, use either the Nornstone of Lethal Will to extend any damage buffs that you already have, plus add another damage buff when fighting tough enemies on activation, or use the Tactagon to increase any status damage you output from your ranged attacks. And there you go, that's it for gear. So, to summarize this build, we have 100% crit chance, infinite heroic cycle, infinite intrinsic cycle, built-in single attack battery, shock status leak, and even self-healing. Here's a little showcase of the build in action in the harm room. Okay, 3, 2. Oh! Oh my! Did you see that? That was over 1 million damage with a missile! And I didn't even have a damage buff up! Oh my god! I got 560k on each missile! And there you go, that's my Iron Man Prime build, but that is it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it useful. If you did, please like, subscribe, and if you want to come and talk about this live, come check me out over on twitch.tv/BobDuckNWeave or connect with me on socials at BobDuckNWeave. All the links are in the description down below. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, consider clicking the join button and becoming a member. You'll get emotes that you can use in comments, live chat, and a cool badge that evolves as your membership continues, which looks really cool when I stream it over here on YouTube. Thanks again, and as always, stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.